Porque estas personas,
because those people were guilty, no matter what. The woman who had the key heard the anguish, the cries for help. She ignored them, and these are the consequences of not doing her job as she should have done.
That's Emeline Guadalupe del Cid Linares, a survivor of the fire at Hogar Seguro Virgen de la Asunción, or just Hogar Seguro, a children's home in San Jose Pinula, near Guatemala City. She's speaking about the sentencing of those responsible for the deaths of 41 girls on March 8, 2017, when a fire consumed the wing of the facility they were locked into. On International Women's Day, no less. Hogar Seguro, or Safe Household, has been one of the most talked about cases in the international press in recent years in Guatemala. Here, though, the ghastly crime stirred indignation because these were children, girls. And the apathy that the accused at times showed seemed to be yet another example of how the state had abandoned the girls, and at the same time had kept the door locked shut.
In Nicaragua, the house arrest of Daniel Ortega's brother
relates more to El Salvador and Honduras than to Guatemala. In the case of Guatemala,
they say globalism comes to die at CIPA, but in El Salvador, it's already dead.
Central America in Minutes, an original podcast by El Faro English.
Also on today's show, an annual State Department report whitewashes the Bukele regime's mounting human rights abuses in El Salvador. But first, the Hogar Seguro case. This Tuesday, August 12th, the sentencing hearing was held for 7 of those accused for the deaths of 41 girls and the injuries of 15 more. A criminal court ruled Carlos Rodas, former Secretary of Welfare for the Presidency, guilty. Santos Torres, former director of Hogar Seguro, guilty. Brenda Chaman, former head of protection against abuse at the Welfare Secretariat, guilty. Luis Perez, former head of operations at the 13th Commissariat of the National Civil Police, guilty. Lucinda Marroquin, former deputy police inspector, guilty. Gloria Castro, former children's advocate at the Human Rights Ombudsman, guilty. They each received between 25 and 6 years in prison, partly commutable. Only the 7th defendant, Harold Flores, former head of the Office for Minors at the Ombudsman, was acquitted for lack of evidence. Anaí Keller, the former Undersecretary of Social Welfare, was also removed from the case on May 15th by the Constitutional Court. The case will go on. Strikingly, the judge ordered the Public Prosecutor's Office to next investigate the involvement of then-President Jimmy Morales. Witnesses said that, prior to the fire, he exchanged calls with those responsible and ordered the police to remain inside Hogar Seguro because the girls, along with the boys in the home, had tried to escape the day before the fire to denounce inhumane treatment at the facility. Autopsies of the girls, for example, detected substances such as fentanyl, morphine, and quetiapine. The children were desperate and wanted to flee on March 7th. Some had to cross rivers filled with sewage, but the police returned them to the facility and ordered that 56 girls be locked in a 6-by-7 meter room containing only 22 mattresses. Surviving witnesses say they were unable to leave the room, not even to the bathroom, because the door was locked and the only window was sealed. They spent the night dirty, wet, and even without shoes. Although they were given food, they did not eat it for fear that it had been laced with sleeping pills. In desperation, they set fire to a mattress. And although they called for help because of the smoke and fire, and some staff members warned Deputy Inspector Marroquin that they were in danger, it took several crucial minutes before the door was opened. In the sentencing, the judge read a phrase that Marroquin allegedly said during the fire. "Let those hijas de la gran puta," roughly daughters of bitches, burn. Let's see if they're as good at getting out of there as they are at escaping. 17 girls died instantly. 2 later died on site. 11 died at the San Juan de Dios General Hospital. 10 died at the Roosevelt Hospital. And 1 died in the United States because she had been transferred there for surgery for her burns. After 8 years of waiting and more than 120 hearings, half a dozen officials responsible for these crimes against children have been convicted. Yet some of the victims still fear retaliation from the accused. Perhaps Emeline del Cid said it best, quote, I name them responsible for any attacks against me or my family, since they know my address. Hey, before our second segment, I want to invite you to join our crowdfunding community. This is episode 40 of Central American Minutes, a show bringing you the sharpest stories from our region at its most critical juncture in decades. To support independent journalism, go to support.elfaro.net to help us keep translating Central America. On Tuesday, the State Department categorically stated that, quote, there were no credible reports of significant human rights abuses, close quote, in El Salvador in its annual human rights report on countries receiving U.S. aid and UN member states. Just last year, the same report, referring to events in 2023, spoke of prisoners beaten to death by guards, pregnant prisoners suffering miscarriages, and surveillance of opponents and journalists. One Biden official who spoke to El Faro English at the time portrayed the report as a balancing act in which, quote, everyone can find what they want to read. Now, though, the 2024 report sheds any veneer of balance, minimizing the continued human rights violations under the state of exception and the existence of political prisoners in El Salvador, as identified by the U.S. government's own past reporting. This tone starkly contrasts with the State Department's reporting on Nicaragua, which identified ongoing persecution of religious leaders and other perceived dissidents, including by para-police, killings, disappearances, and torture, and transnational repression of dissidents, among others. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has a long record of criticizing abuses by the Ortega and Murillo regime in Nicaragua. But in El Salvador, the Bukele regime has cultivated close cooperation with the Trump administration. Virtually every statement in the report directly contradicts Salvadoran civil society reporting. For example, the new report asserts that, quote, the government generally respected, close quote, freedom of expression and the press. In the last 2 months, at least 80 journalists and human rights defenders have fled for exile, and a committee of relatives of persecuted and political prisoners in El Salvador registered 28 people in political prison as of March, many of the cases dating early back into Bukele's first term. The report follows reforms approved by the Bukele-controlled Legislative Assembly on July 31st that allow Bukele to run for re-election indefinitely. The regime in El Salvador was quick to show off this endorsement. Bukele reposted on X an official position of the U.S. government, quote, we reject the comparison of El Salvador's democratic and constitutionally sound legislative process with illegitimate dictatorial regimes in other parts of our region, close quote. In our June 15th issue of Central America Monthly, we observe how the Bukele dictatorship has indeed become the second regime in Central America after Ortega and Murillo. And we identified just a few of their common threads left out from this year's report on El Salvador, not only on constitutional re-election and total power, but also the neighboring police states, foreign agents laws, exiles, and political prisoners. Thanks for streaming our weekly podcast, Central America in Minutes. Today's episode was written by Juliana Ramazzini and Ramiro Guevara. Production and soundtrack by Omnian. Editing by me, Roman Gressier. Subscribe and share wherever you do your streaming. We'll be back next week. Hasta pronto.